Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week. It didn't start with the boots. It didn't start with the violence. It started with a generation of young men born out of a post-war world that had left them with little but their pride and their fists. They were the sons of factory workers, miners and soldiers, kids who grew up in the shadow of hardship, with the weight of history pressing down on them. They weren't the first to look for an escape. The mods had their scooters, the rockers had their bikes, and the hippies had their peace. But this new breed wasn't interested in free love or flower power. They were about hard work, streetwise smarts, and the unity of their crew. The skinheads were born from this working class revolution, rejecting the counterculture, rejecting the establishment, and embracing a different kind of rebellion. Skinheads were the first to sport the look, the shaved heads, the boots, the braces. They took their style from Jamaican immigrants who brought ska and reggae with them. They were proud of their working class roots, proud of their toughness, but their world was one of camaraderie, not violence, but something darker was bubbling underneath. In the mid-1970s, things started to change. Football, once a working class pastime, began to attract a different kind of crowd, those who weren't just there for the match. It wasn't just about cheering on your team anymore. It was about representing your patch, your firm. And with that came the violence, the territorial fights, the clashes with rival gangs, and the undeniable need to prove yourself on the terraces. This wasn't about football. It was about pride, loyalty, and taking liberties. The Boot Boys were born from this new wave. A tighter, tougher breed of fans, they adopted the skinhead look, but injected it with something new: aggression, violence, and a sense of ownership over the streets. It wasn't enough to just be a skinhead anymore. You had to be someone. And the terraces became their battlefield. They weren't just spectators, they were participants. And if you wanted to make your mark, you had to fight for it. The name Boot Boys didn't just come from the boots. It was a way of life. Every step, every punch, every fight was part of the culture. The Dr. Martens boots were more than footwear. They were weapons, steel-capped, ready for action. And the firm? It wasn't just a group of fans. It was a brotherhood, forged in the fires of violence and unity. Together, they were unstoppable. And so, the Boot Boys were born, pushing forward from the skinhead movement into something darker, harder, and, for some, unforgiving. The terraces were their home, and nothing would ever be the same again. But it wasn't just the boots. It was the jacket, the Harrington jacket, clean, sharp, sleek, worn by the mods before, but redefined by the Boot Boys. It wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was part of the uniform, a badge of honour. And for the Boot Boys, every jacket told a story. It told where you were from. It told what firm you belonged to. But the look wasn't just about intimidation, it was about brotherhood. The uniform tied them together, forging bonds stronger than anything else. The colours, the cuts, the brands, they weren't just for show. They spoke volumes about who you were, where you came from, and who you stood with. You wore your firm's colours like a badge of honour, because your firm was your family, your brothers in arms. The jacket was your shield, your boots, your sword. And then there was the hair, the cropped buzzed look, shaved close to the scalp, the skinhead style. It wasn't about following fashion, it was about power. A skinhead's head was a blank canvas, a symbol of pure, undiluted aggression. But it was also about belonging. It was about saying, I'm part of this. I'm part of this crew. I'm part of something bigger than myself. Everything about the Boot Boys look was designed to make a statement. The clothes, the hair, the boots, they were all tools for survival. In a world where respect wasn't freely given, It had to be earned. And you didn't earn it by playing nice. You earned it by walking tall, by standing your ground, and by never backing down. This was their world, and they dressed for it. In the streets of Britain, on the terraces, and in the pubs, this was the uniform that ruled. And if you wore it, you were part of something that could never be undone. The Boot Boys weren't just a subculture, they were a movement. And their uniform? That was their armour. Football wasn't just a game. It wasn't about the beautiful game, the glory or the goals. It was about ownership. It was about territory. The game became a battleground, not just for the players, but for the fans. And it wasn't just the matchday rivalries that made it intense. It was the fight for control, the hunger to claim dominance over the other. The terraces weren't just a place to watch the match. They were a stage for violence, a place where emotions ran high and fists flew just as fast as the ball on the pitch. Football firms, groups of fans united by more than just loyalty to a team began to form. Each firm claimed its ground, its territory, and would defend it at all costs. This wasn't a casual rivalry anymore. This was war. The fans weren't just cheering their team on, they were ready to fight, for the firm, for the honour of their patch, for the pride of their team. And the violence. It wasn't random. It was calculated. When you stood on the terraces with your firm, you didn't just wear your colours. In the early 1970s, football firms became a way of life. These weren't just groups of fans, they were families. And, like any family, they had their rivalries. The most famous firms, West Ham's Intercity firm, Manchester United's Red Army, Leeds Service Crew, each with its own legacy, each with its own story of clashes, betrayals, and, of course, the violence that came with it. But the most important thing for these men was the thrill. It wasn't just about a fight after the game. It was about the power of being part of something bigger, of knowing you had the strength of your brothers behind you. The adrenaline rush wasn't just from the football match. It was from the fear and respect you commanded in the streets, at the train stations, in the pubs. The fight wasn't just a fight. It was an initiation, a test. If you stood your ground, you earned your place. And if you didn't, you were out. When the match was over, the real battle began. If you were lucky, the violence happened outside the stadium, in the streets, away from the eyes of the police. But sometimes it spilled over into the stands. The riots, the fights, no one cared about the score anymore. It was about taking control of the terraces, about winning the fight before your rivals did. The Boot Boys had found their place, not just in the stadium, but in the very heart of the hooligan culture. And as the fights grew fiercer and the stakes higher, it became clear. Football was no longer just a sport. It was a way of life, a fight for identity. And the Boot Boys were right at the centre of it all. When you think of football violence in the 1970s, you think of the Boot Boys. But they weren't the only ones. There were those who took it one step further, a group that became synonymous with fighting, aggression and unrelenting rivalry, the Bovver Boys. The Bovver Boys didn't just represent a firm, they represented an ideology. They weren't in it just for the football or the fight. They were in it for the chaos. The Bovver Boys weren't a single group or firm. They were a mindset, a movement born out of the same violent spirit that the Boot Boys championed, but taken to an extreme. If the Boot Boys were the fighters of the terraces, the Bovver Boys were the ones who took the fight to the streets, to the pubs, to wherever they could cause havoc. They weren't content with just the turf of their football teams. They wanted the streets. They wanted control. If you were a Bovver boy, you didn't just wear your boots. You wore your anger on your sleeve. You were defined not by what you said, but by what you did. And what you did was fight. The term Bovver Boys became synonymous with trouble. Trouble at football grounds, in pubs, at train stations. But they didn't start as a separate group. Like the Boot Boys, they emerged from the skinhead scene, though they were a little younger, a little more reckless. They saw the violence of the terraces, and they took it beyond, into the pubs, the streets, and the train stations, where they could be just as dangerous. If the Boot Boys were the hard-nosed veterans of the terraces, the Bovver Boys were the next wave, the ones ready to take on anyone who crossed their path. The Bovver Boys didn't just fight for their firm's colours, they fought for their reputation. And they weren't afraid to mix it up with anyone. Other football firms, rival gangs, the police. If you stood in their way, you became a target. But in the chaos of their rise, the Bovver Boys were also creating something deeper. They were more than just a violent group. They were the embodiment of a generation forged in the aftermath of a changing world. They came from the same places as the Boot Boys, but they didn't just want to be part of the football subculture. They wanted to be its apex, the most feared, the most notorious. And so, the Bovver Boys rose, turning their anger and aggression into a form of power that couldn't be ignored. But what they didn't know, what no one saw coming, was that the violence that defined them would eventually come to consume them. It was a battle for respect. For a generation, the Bovver Boys were more than just a group. They were a symbol of raw, untamed power. But, as the years passed, the world they once ruled began to change. The violence, the chaos, it couldn't last forever. And as the football firms became more and more synonymous with police crackdowns, riots, and government intervention, the Bovver Boys began to fade. But their legacy, that would never be forgotten. The landscape of football violence was changing. The police were cracking down harder, stadium bans were being handed out like candy, and the old guard of the Bovver Boys, they were either aging or fading into obscurity. But in the shadows, their spirit lived on. Though the original Bovver Boys might have disappeared from the terraces, their influence was never erased. The youth who grew up in the 1980s saw them as legends. They weren't just figures of violence, they were icons of rebellion, of defiance, and their legacy would inspire a new generation of punks, skinheads, and football hooligans. The spirit of the Bovver Boys wasn't about to go quietly. The new generation didn't know the Bovver Boys personally, but they knew the stories. They knew the power of walking into a pub and taking control of the room with just the weight of your stare. They knew that it wasn't about how much you had. It was about what you could take. And the Bovver Boys had taken it all. For the men who lived the life, the legacy is a complicated one. The rush of violence, the brotherhood, the dominance. It was intoxicating. But as the years went by, some started to ask themselves, was it worth it? The scars, the arrests, the rivalries that left no room for peace. The old wounds never fully healed. The thrill of the fight gave way to a quieter existence. But the ghosts of the past remained. The Bovver Boys may have faded from the streets, but their story was written in blood. It's in the men who lived it, in the scars they carry, and in the mythos that still circulates around their name. But even now, all these years later, the question remains, was it worth the price they paid? The Bovver Boys left behind a legacy, for better or for worse. They were the last true rebels of the terraces, the men who didn't just follow the crowd, but forged their own path. They were the ghosts of football's violent past, and no matter how much time passes, their story will always remain part of the fabric of the game. The streets will remember them, the terraces will remember them, and in the memories of those who lived it, the Bovver Boys will never truly fade. The game has changed. The stadiums are safer, the violence more controlled. The Bovver Boys are a thing of the past, and yet the echoes of their legacy still reverberate in the terraces, the streets, and the pubs. The spirit of the fight, the territorialism, the brotherhood, it's still there, even if it's not as visible as it once was. Football hooliganism may have been redefined over the years, but the impulse, the need to belong, to fight, to represent, is still alive. The newer generation may not understand the full story of the Bovver Boys, but they inherit their attitude. They still show up to the stadiums in packs, still share the same defiant energy that once defined the terraces. The Bovver Boys may have faded from the mainstream, but their legacy lives on in the pubs, in the moments of tension, and in the rivalries that still simmer beneath the surface. Even in the modern era, where the violence has been reduced to a simmer, the mentality remains. It's just more covert now. They called them smoothies, Bovver Boys, hard mods, or simply boot boys. Working class kids growing up in Great Britain's notoriously socially stratified milieu during the late 60s and early 70s, with a disdain for anything reeking of the upper or middle classes, like their progeny in the contemporary bourgeois hippie subculture. They had an affinity for close-cropped or mod-length hair, steel-toe boots, huge asset in street fights, straight Levi jeans or star-pressed trousers, suspenders, braces and buttoned-up shirts, alongside a penchant for short, simple and loud guitar-based tunes with anthem-like choruses, strongly prevalent in the glam rock hits of the day. It is those shouted choruses, like chants on the stadium terraces, cheering on the favourite team playing the beautiful workers' game known as football, that resonate as a primal call to arms. The aristocracy had organised and codified football, but it was the lower classes that played it. I want to delve a little into the music that inspired the Bovver Boys, Boot Boys and Skinheads of that era. Bands like Cocksparrow, Sham 69, Cockney Rejects and the like are responsible for that. I will say that kids who became skinheads in the late 70s and 80s heard these tunes in their pre-teen years and were subconsciously influenced by them, as well as seeing older brother and cousins dressing up in boots and braces, along with being surrounded by football culture. The glam rock influence would appear to be the complete antithesis to the boot boy ethos, what with its flamboyant and androgynous fashion sense, but sharp, catchy boot boy glam songs underpinning a basic rock and roll beat proved to be a source of future reference for the no-fuss, pure impact sound of the skinhead, oi, brigade in the decades that followed. Put yourself in the mindset of a teenage yob in that time period. Your school grades aren't exactly stellar, and the prospect of borstal or a dreary factory or mill job awaits you. All you can look forward to is listening to loud tunes, dressing sharp, being one of the boys, rooting for your local team and waiting for the weekend drinking benders, because everyone knows Saturday night's alright for fighting. The Bovver boot crushing the Crunch logo on the front cover of the 45 record from 1974 exemplifies the boot boy glam sound to a T hand claps, dirty rock and roll swagger, massive hooks, and a chorus that proclaims, clap your hands, stomp your feet. Imagine the weekend teen dances at a council estate in London's East End, the kids decked out in Harrington or Crombie jackets, cardigan, via-neck sweaters, flat-fronted slacks or jeans, buttoned-up shirts, hair cropped with a 2 or 3 grade clip guard short, but not bald, and of course the prerequisite steel-toe boots. All the better for stomping the dance halls or rival mobs, and doing it all over again the following weekend, as this riotous tune proclaims. Take some Pete Townsend power chords, lyrics about going down the terraces on a Saturday night with mates looking for a punch-up, as played by a band composed of flares and braces, wearing boot boys and mods. Then you have a basic component of the skinhead, oi, ethos in its embryonic stage. Juk put out 5 glam and power pop-tinge singles between 72 and 74, and a posthumous EP in 78, from which this 1974 song is taken. They clearly wrote from direct experience, in the language of their brethren in the different working class. Doc Martens and Crombies, overcoats, all tooled up as well. If you come to cheer, you better stay clear. You'll sign your own death knell. Arguably the first skinhead band to release a 45 record in 1968, Neat Change was composed of West London boot boys who were just as likely to be in the audience as on stage. By the time of this release, the quartet had actually altered its sound from the hard soul sound it had been playing in mod clubs for years, with a notable months-long residency at the world-famous Marquee Club, packed with hundreds of Skinhead fans. The 45th goes for more of a pop psychedelic sound. Their menacing, short-haired working-class look was a sharp counter to London's freewheeling psychedelic swinging scene, something that was definitely noticed by then Slade manager Chaz Chandler, who came around with the prospect of managing them, but nothing came of it. The only noticeable outcome was Slade's decision to go the Skinhead route, based on Chandler's suggestion by '69, at which point Neat Change had broken up due to bad management and a lack of concrete musical direction. Forever Blowing Bubbles was a Tin Pan Alley hit from the early 20th century that became the official anthem for West Ham United, a football club based out of London's East End. One of Oy's leading lights, the Cockney Rejects, immortalised the song on a 45 from 1980, but legions of boot boys had previously sung it at the top of their lungs on the terraces, especially directed at supporters of their traditional rivals from the Millwall Football Club. The feeling of camaraderie, massive sing-along choruses, and cheering your squad on against a common enemy are all vital components of OE. Music's DNA and subsequent blueprint. The legendary Third World War formed in the year 1970. The engineer on their self-titled debut LP famously declared, "I want a no-bullshit working-class band. I've had enough of this pseudo-peace crap." He got that and more. The attitude prevalent on the album sounded a death knell to the utopian hippie dream, with lyrics laying out the day-to-day plight of workers, with no time for pretense or idealistic rhetoric. The tunes are straightforward, bluesy-tinged rockers sung by an everyman voice. This would prove to be hugely influential to the subsequent class, Conscious Oi, and punk bands that strove to give a voice to the underpaid, overworked masses, teeming with unfulfilled ambitions. Scottish rockers Iron Virgin started out wearing clockwork orange garb, then changed to American football player outfits with chastity belts, and released this quintessential bootboy glam song. A defiant pose calling for kids to rebel, get up, stand up, set to thunderous drums and galloping riffs, is a mystery why this 45 from 1974 never made the top of the charts. Maybe the band's name was too controversial, especially when aiming this material at glam's pre-pubescent target audience. Only people from their near circle or in the know were privy to this rebel sound, but American producer Kim Fowley must have been paying attention as he reworked this tune into the Runaways' California Paradise from 1977's Queens of Noise. If working is the curse of the drinking classes, then Sir Elton John and his frequent songwriting collaborator Bernie Taupin created one of the most devastatingly accurate portraits of disaffected British youth by way of this unhinged rocker from 1973. It may look strange for someone of Elton's stature to be associated with this street genre, but Bernie's background growing up with juvenile hooligans lends credibility to the subject matter. Familiar concerns, drinking, fighting, dysfunctional family life, anti-authoritarian behaviour, and living for the weekend figure prominently in the lyrics. It's the last two lines that land this song in the Bootboy Hall of Fame. I'm a juvenile product of the working class, whose best friend floats in the bottom of a glass. I would frequently see Fresh's 1970 Fresh Out of Borstal LP in the bins during my record collecting days, and judging by the gritty black and white cover of 3 authentic-looking boot boys, plus the Borstal tag, I'd figure this is going to be the hardest Skinhead Oi record ever. The music inside didn't pan out that way. It's heavier on the funky horns or percussion-driven instrumentals vein, but the backstory behind it is top-notch. A big-time record producer created this concept album based on the trials and tribulations of young British delinquents. studio musicians provided a soundtrack for the spoken word efforts of 3 former guests of the Borstal system. The result is a true-to-life account of life in and out of this now abolished reform school in what is arguably the first appearance of actual Skinheads on a full-length LP. Sweet were one of the pre-eminent glam rock bands between 71 to 74. They put out one UK chart-topping single after another, splitting the difference between catchy bubblegum pop and hard rock. Beloved by boot boys at the time, the song's the pro-juvenile, anti-authoritarian lyrics, as well as drummer Mick Turner's R.I.P. thunderous, martial opening beat, were widely imitated on countless Oi stompers to come. Influential Oi, label Vulture Rock Records, was originally named the Steve Priest Fan Club, as a tribute to Sweet's flamboyant and at times controversial bass player. These North UK country lads looked more like factory workers or bricklayers, but they recorded the ultimate glam anthem, a now classic rock staple, All the Young Dudes. The B-side to the gender-bending David Bowie-penned classic is this upfront rocker aimed at teenagers and their ever-present struggle against the adult world. Mott singer Ian Hunter's limited vocal range was an asset that made the band accessible to the average bloke, who not only related to the lyrics, but could see themselves singing them, absent any high-mannered, stylized vocal delivery. The slashing chords and lyrics depict a rock star's confession that after all the trappings of fame, at heart, he's still one of the nameless kids that dreamed of stardom, just waiting to be thrust back among them. There were 2 main styles within the glam rock movement of the early 70s. The more art school influenced glitter of David Bowie, Roxy Music, Brian Eno, and the loud, straightforward, clap your hands and stomp your feet swagger of Sweet Mud, Hector, and these unruly rockers, Slade. Starting out heavily R&B and Motown influenced and tracing their origins to the mid-60s, by 1969, Slade had briefly adopted a skinhead look on the advice of their manager, Chas Chandler. Legend has it that Chandler was inspired by local skinhead outfit, Neat Change, and football hooligans. Not that Slade were slouches in that department, having rough individuals like singer Noddy Holder in the band. Slade's tough-as-nails image, the unmistakably raucous British vocals, basic no-pretense rock-and-roll sound, all proved to be a vital soundtrack for many a boot boy's formative years. Another prime example of a super catchy football anthem, meant for massive sing-alongs, this original composition released as a 45 record in 1972, was actually sung by the then members of Leeds United and their supporters. The lyrics stress loyalty, strength in numbers, pride in the pack and your squad. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you subscribe, you will be notified when we release a new video. It could be your firm we make a video about next, so don't miss out and hit the subscribe button. You can find me on Facebook or email me if you have a good story to tell. See you next time.